Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first seminar of 2023. Let's hope it's a productive year. So for our first talk, we have Dr. Colleen Seymour. She's working with SANBI. She's been working for the past 20 odd years in and around South Africa. She'll be talking a bit of the work she started when she was doing a PhD, looking at Acacia erioloba, now Vachellia erioloba. So many of you might know the camelthorn as a firewood species, but they're actually quite protected, both provincially and nationally. And they're very slow growing, and this is what Colleen investigated, and I won't spoil much of it, but it is a keystone species, and it's very special to our arid savanna. And with that, I'll hand over to Colleen.
Great, thank you, Vaynant, and thank you everyone for coming and for the chance to talk to you today. I'm going to switch my video off so we can focus on the actual slides. So yes, so this is, Vaynant's very capably introduced me. I work at Kirstenbosch SANBI, and I'm a principal scientist there. And as Vaynant said, this work is about it was a revisit to my study site after 15 years, and it looked at mean height increase in saplings of Vachellia erioloba, which please forgive me, I may sometimes call it Acacia erioloba because somehow my brain is still stuck there despite the renaming of them about a good 15 years ago. So, there we go. Okay, so this is work that I did with my co-authors, co-workers, Grant Joseph, Vaynant Karlitz, who you know. Joe was actually the person who said to me, I happened to be up at Kimberley, and he said, why don't you go and remeasure those saplings that you looked at during your PhD? And so I said, oh, all right, we'll go see if we can find any of them. And then Chalilo and Helga were also so helpful. So thank you to them. And also for their work on the manuscript that we submitted, which is now as a paper in Ecospheres. So why Vachellia erioloba, and why does it matter? Why do we care? So large trees in arid savannas are keystone structures. They provide nests for raptors. As you can see here, we've got a nest of technology in me, nest of a sociable weaver colony in this big tree. They also are places where mammals will tend to go and congregate in the shade and then tend to be more droppings. And so then the soil beneath the tree is richer in nutrients. And also because that also creates a bit of a microhabitat in terms of shade. And so there's the soils are slightly wetter. And also birds come and deposit seeds of fruiting species under the trees. And so you get a completely different suite of plant species beneath the trees compared to out in the open. And on Kalahari sands, where rainfall is less than 400 millimeters, the only tree to really grow to any large size is Acacia erioloba. Vachellia erioloba, there we are, I did it. So despite being a protected species, which means you can't even collect its seed pods, let alone chop them down, they are still a popular source of firewood. And so this is a case of illegal firewood removal up in the Northern Cape. And it's a popular source of firewood because it's a nice hard wood, it burns slowly, but they appear to be very slow growing. And we also don't know how often they recruit. And from there, how many of them make it to larger size classes. Spoiler alert, I still don't know, but we are moving towards the answer for that. And I just want to show you this slide here. This is a picture that Sue Milton took in 2001, which explains the very low prices, 7 Rand for camelthorn and 10 Rand for some vineyard stumps. But you can see there that the price of removal, the actual ecological cost, is not being factored in of removing this keystone species from its system. So in arid environments, you may expect the trees to only recruit in years of good rainfall. And this has been the case in species like Acacia mellifera, and also others, acacias, I keep calling them acacias. Can we just go with that for now? And other members of that genus, well, actually there are 3 different genera. So they do seem to show in arid areas cohorted recruitment. And if you look at the Kalahari savanna, for example, this parkland here at Benfontein, it does look like they all belong to a similar size class, so similar age class. And so I'm now going to just give you a bit of a rundown on what a paper that came out of my PhD in 2008 in plant ecology, which looked at grass, rainfall, and herbivores as determinants of what was then Acacia erioloba recruitment in an African savanna. And we know that climatic conditions and disturbance regimes dictate that although seedlings may germinate and recruit into the sapling bank, they then may spend years trapped in the small size classes. And so I was interested in, well, what is the demography really like for these, for this tree, and do we see evidence of cohorted recruitment? So I started with a question of, does the size class distribution of Vachellia erioloba, 2 sites near Kimberley, Benfontein, and the neighboring farms, Susanne and Olifantsrug, suggest cohorted recruitment? And so what I did was I had 53 plots of 25 by 25 meters randomly dispersed across the 2 farms. And every single erioloba that I encountered, I measured its height, I measured the diameter of its largest horizontal canopy extent, and that was D1, and then at D2 was the extent at 90 degrees to that. Then I counted the number of stems above ground and the size of the thickness of the largest stem above ground. And then for those that were less than 1.5 meters tall, I dug 3 centimeters below ground and measured the stem size there. And so what we see, let me go back to this one, is we see very few adults, and we definitely see a lot of saplings. So there's a big sapling bank. You see Benfontein is the blue and Susanne is the red, and we can see it does seem to be more of an issue on Benfontein. And when you look at the underground sizes, then you see something else. You see, firstly, that they're probably not all didn't all recruit at the same time. The blue curve is Benfontein and the red curve being Susanna. So the other point to note is that on Susanna, there seems to be a different process going on to what's going on Benfontein. So the question is, there seems to be continuous recruitment, but few opportunities to escape. Here we have a sapling, and then underneath, here's its underground stem, which is going all over the place and gets quite thick compared to what we see above ground. So the question was it browsing, or was it lack of water, or possibly both? So the first question was, how does provision of supplemental water influence growth rates in Vachellia erioloba saplings? And then I also wanted to know, how does exposure to herbivores, both grazers and browsers, influence relative growth rates? So I had 4 treatments with herbivores excluded or water supplemented, different variations of those. And then I had, on the 2 farms, I had 5 plots of each, so 10 plots altogether, with 3 of each of the 4 treatments. In other words, 120 saplings altogether. And because we might expect those with larger underground stems to grow faster than those without, I tried to ensure that there was equal representation of the different size classes spread across all of the treatments, so that wouldn't explain any differences you might see. And so what do we get? When we look at water versus no water, so I went and I watered them every week with a certain amount of water, which would come to look like or be the equivalent amount of rain of a very good rainfall year. So it wasn't just randomly chucking water on, it was carefully measured amounts as if we'd had a particularly good rainfall year. And we see that with water, they did do a little bit better, but that was not significant. So although given supplemental water, they did show greater growth, the difference was not statistically significant. Similarly, with herbivores excluded, interestingly enough, those ones did worse in the trend, but again, this was not significant. So where herbivores were excluded, I would have thought, oh, herbivores are browsing them, but it seems that grazers were more important on the farms at that time. And maybe because there were quite a few cows around, they were getting rid of the grass, which competes. What I did find, however, is a significant effect of the exclosures and watering. And in fact, the group that did the best, C, they were ones that had received water and they had had no exclosure. So it seems that grass perhaps is part of the reason for the difference that you see between the two groups. However, I then did an experiment where I removed grass from around the plants, but and again, there was those that had had grass removed from around them did a bit better, but not a lot better. So it seems to be that it is water as well that's important. So how much growth did we have in that season? I think one of the important things that came out of that 2003 to November 2003 to April 2004 study was that the mean height increase of those 120 saplings was 43.1 millimeters in a growing season. In other words, about 4 centimeters in height on average. And even the best group only grew on average about 6 centimeters over the season. Although I went to check the literature and it wasn't so dissimilar to what Myra Barnes found in 1999 in her PhD that she did in Botswana, where she found a mean growth of 48 millimeters of her saplings. So the question was, how much growth was there after 15 years if we went back and visited them, if we could find them? And so some of them still had the poles near them, and we could find 67 of the original 120. And of these, 3 had died. So we had a 4.5% mortality over the 15 years, which is quite low. Over 15 years. So then the 3 that had died were amongst the smallest of the group. They were amongst the 38 smaller percent, 40% smallest, but they were not the smallest. So it wasn't the only predictor of whether they would die or not. So if we look at how much did they grow in those 15 years, well, in the season of 2003 to 2004, as you recall, the mean growth was 43 millimeters. So we might expect that over 15 years, we times that by 43.1 by 15, we get about 647, with about 65 centimeters change in height. So I went there expecting to have seen some difference. But quite gobsmackingly, we found that they'd only grown on average 45 millimeters. So 4.5 centimeters in the 15 years. So this is a real bit of a heads up about removing these trees. It is being done illegally at times. I do often challenge shop owners who then tell me that it's being imported from Namibia. And in South Africa, as far as I know, you're not even allowed to remove the deadwood. So don't ever let shop owners tell you that it's deadwood. But that change in variation was very large. So I'm going to zoom in on this graph in a bit more. If we look at the frequency, we see that height change over 16 years for the large majority was between 0 and 20 centimeters. Actually, we know now closer to 4 centimeters. But the problem is we also had some that lost 80 centimeters and some that gained 60 centimeters. So there was a large variation in height change over the 15 years. Sorry that says 60. And then change in diameter of the largest stem. We can see also that the largest stem had grown by 0.5 centimeters, even if it was the largest stem. I'm not even sure that they are the same stems that we're measuring, because my notes had just said largest stem. So we don't know if the stems that we're seeing 15 years later are the same ones that we're measuring. But nevertheless, the increase is about 0.5 centimeter over 15 years. It's very slow. The other thing that was interesting was that the change in height was quite linked to the change in height, the original starting height in 2004. So you can see here that for trees, less than about this amount here, 30 centimeters, they did tend to increase in height. But past that, there seems to be this decrease in height. So the bigger you were in 2004, once you're past a certain height, you were more likely to lose height than gain it, which I thought of first as the grass ceiling. So what we did find, so there didn't seem to be a reliable relationship with previous height and height later, but what we did find is that there was a strong correlation between the average of D1 and D2 in 2004 and that of D1 and D2 in 2020. So it should be 2019, but it doesn't matter. So if you look at this relationship here, it's strongly significant. And we actually found that horizontal canopy grew much better than height. We saw a mean of 120.2 millimeters over 15 years. So that's 12 centimeters over 15 years. It's still not exactly the fastest growing tree around, I'm sure, sapling around, but still growth in the horizontal axis was better than vertical. And this then made me think about some work I'd read about a few years earlier by Julia Wakeling. It was part of her MSc. And she highlighted that it wasn't the mean increases in growth in sapling that matters as to when some trees become large enough to escape disturbance, but the growth of the fastest growing individuals. And so to take for an example, she looked at 3 Acacia species and this Acacia Karoo. If you look at this is the mean, this line here shows you mean growth. And so to reach the magic height of 3 meters to escape fire in the systems in which it grows, it would need to not be burnt for about 13 years. If, however, you look at the top 80%, they can get away, they can escape fire and other disturbance within 5 years. And the top 5% here, they can actually escape in less than 5 years, about 3 or so years. So if fires are very regular, it's possible that it's just those very best growing ones that grow. So my question were the fastest growing individuals between the 2003 and 2004 season the same individuals that grew the fastest between 2004 and subsequent measuring of them in 2020? And if we look at that, if we plot them both, mean diameter 2003 in November 2003 versus, sorry about that, versus 2004, and then again the starting diameter versus 2020, then those that occur above the line they'd be kind of overachievers because they're doing better than average, and those below the line are your underachievers. And so the question was, are these ones that are above the line the same individuals between 2003 and 4 and 2020? And so all I did was I looked at these residuals and then I assessed whether they were correlated. In other words, if it was a large positive in 2003, is it the same individual still a large positive over the intervening period? And actually, we found that the residuals before and residuals after were significantly associated, correlated. So in other words, they are the same individuals that do better. So the main findings and conclusions of the study are firstly that the mean change in height over 15 years is not that different to a single season, only about 4 centimeters. And this has implications for modeling. A lot of modeling studies will go, okay, so now we're going to model what trees are going to do over 20 years. And then they take findings from a study of a single year and they just multiply that by 20. It wouldn't work for Vachellia erioloba in our study sites. Maybe elsewhere, I don't know, but certainly it's pause for thought. Secondly, the increase in canopy volume, the size growth was quite big. compared to vertical, but still not massive. And those that grew the fastest before were the same as those that grew fastest over the years. So it seems to be that those individuals are inherently better, like genetically, like Usain Bolt might be, or maybe they just happen to grow in an area which is, maybe they're not coming, being hit by a lot of frost or herbivores or on a game path or something like that. So there could be a combination of genetics and luck. I don't know. The other point to note is that mortality rate was very low. It's about 0.3% per year compared to other studies, so for instance, in West Africa, Sebastian Barrault, and colleagues looked at acacia burning and survival, and their studies found per year 4 to 15% mortality, so quite high compared to ours. But we might expect low mortality for a species with low recruitment rates and long-lived adults. So it may be that that's the strategy. You recruit slowly, you live a long time, you produce a lot of seeds, and eventually some go through. And that would be a good strategy, I guess, in an arid environment where rainfall is very unreliable, really. The other thing is, so we expect low mortality rates in dry environments. And as I've said, for modeling studies, this means you can't just extrapolate over 20 years. And I also wondered about what are the implications for using cores for aging. So for instance, often a few studies have looked at the cores of these trees to age them. And I'm not entirely sure that that final stem that we see sticking out of the ground, or those few stems that are sticking out of the ground, are they the originals from way back? And are they as old as the underground structure that supports it? So why so slow? Why they grow so slow? One reason I think is possibly the great rooting depth. Canadell et al. Did a study on rooting depth of species, and they found that for Vachellia erioloba, the rooting depth was to 60 meters. That's what has been recorded. Now, if that's what's been recorded, it's likely that it's a lot more than that. Those just happen to have been found when digging for boreholes and things. And we found this little one. Now, I know it's wrong to dig them up, but this one was growing in the road and probably wasn't going to grow very much. This is Dave from Australia, who was helping me at the time doing my PhD. And that's not the entire root, but you can see the above ground of that's about 3 or 4 centimeters. But it was just busy putting down a taproot. And so we didn't get the whole thing, but we think it was much longer than that, the taproot. So what's limiting it? We don't know, possibly frost. Frost is quite common across much of its distribution. And so maybe frost is resetting the height of these. This is the distribution marked, all records of camelthorn across southern Africa. And you can see, for instance, it goes all the way on into Zambia on Kalahari sands. And I think actually there've been some records in the South Congo, but I'm not sure. But the point is that across its range, it does seem to survive frost, and it doesn't die, but it often has above ground death. So it might be that frost is killing it above ground and resetting it from time to time, and then it's just got to survive, get through a few years where it can actually get past that. But in the meantime, it keeps growing horizontally, which is interesting. So I'm not sure if that's actually the only thing driving it. And I'd be really interested if anybody has any other thoughts. The other thing I just wanted to point to is that Richard Barnes, who was at the Oxford Forestry Institute, took seeds from across the range of erioloba, and he planted them and grew them. And he found that the ones from Zambia and Zimbabwe, particularly in the more mesic areas, grew so much faster, despite them all grew in height so much faster, despite all of them getting the same water and light regimes. And it's probably selection for being able to grow faster above ground in a fire environment, whereas in the more arid part of its range, fire is very rare. And in fact, we find that large trees tend to die in fires. So Acacia erioloba, Vachellia erioloba rather, is not well adapted to fire when it's large, certainly not in the arid areas. So populations in arid areas, we think probably have fewer recruitment events, with fire is far less frequent, if at all. And in the more mesic areas, there's more recruitment events and fire is more frequent. So this points to the value of long-term studies and what everybody at SAEON is doing. And so I really am pleased there is such a thing as SAEON, such an entity as SAEON, an institute. And also the value of long-term study sites. So one of the reasons we couldn't find many of the saplings was that the new owners had taken over management of the one site, and it wasn't in the Benfontein. It wasn't managed in the same way as Benfontein, and they just pulled up the metal rods that were marking them. Of course, now GPSs are much more reliable, and we can probably get to the exact same sapling. But my 2001, I bought it in 2001. GPS wasn't quite up to the job of refinding them. But yes, I would just like to acknowledge De Beers Farms and SAEON for their support. And I'd also like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Richard Dean, who was my PhD supervisor and really did change my life. Who knows where I'd be now if it wasn't for Richard. So on that, I'd like to thank you and invite any questions and comments, and yeah, and see if anybody's interested in continuing with this kind of work, and perhaps we could find new ways to go forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Colleen. That was a really awesome talk. I enjoyed it. So there's one question so far in the chat. Others can raise their hands if they want, and then I'll get to them. Let's start with this question from Lungisi. Does the rooting depth contribute to their adaptations to these environments?
Yes, Mlungisi, I think that they do need to get their roots down to the groundwater. So for instance, if they grow in the riverbeds in the Kalahari Park, then they only need the groundwater, you start to hit at about 5 meters. On our study site, I think the groundwater is at about 20 meters, but in some sites, as Canada's shown, their roots go down to 60. So I think that is part of that's their way of dealing with the lack of water. And it might also be why they will flower every year and hardly ever lose their leaves, because they're not as reliant on current rainfall. They're using groundwater. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
Okay, I see Tony has his hand up. Tony, you want to unmute?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Colleen. That was really interesting for me because we've also been measuring tree growth in the North and a whole lot of trees. Yeah, and also get really slow rates. 2 questions. One is about competition with other trees or shrubs or forbs. I mean, I know things are quite spaced quite far apart there, but was there any sort of indication that if there's clumping that affects the growth rates? And then second question was about drought rather than frost resetting height. And do you have any idea of what the rainfall was like for those 15 years of your study period? Was it above or below, or were there big droughts that could have reset? And was there any sign of like dieback in the canopies?
Yeah. Okay. So the first question. So okay. Yeah, let's start with the first. So the first question is, they actually, you almost you never see a Vachellia erioloba seedling under a tree or under a bush. They are very, very light limited, I think, and I think it might explain why the saplings rather that were in the enclosures that were watered. What happened, I think, is that the grass took advantage of that water and really grew up and shaded out the ones that were in the enclosures. And then there were no grazers to remove that grass. So the combination of water and shading from the grass, I think that the shading was more important in that situation. But yeah, I'd be very interested to hear more about your slow growing species. And then yes, the drought question, yes, I must actually look in more detail at the rainfall. Drought may have set them off, but the thing is, they don't die. And that's why I wasn't sure would drought actually break and kill off the above ground growth, that so much so that they look dead and yet they're still alive. I don't know if my question is making sense.
Yeah, no, well, that's what we saw with the recent drought in the Lowveld. A lot of stems or branches died off, you know, and then your height drops down by like 0.5 meter or something.
Right.
So sometimes even all the way to the ground if they're small. Yeah.
Well, then
so
there had been a bit of a drought before we went to measure, and so that could explain it. So I think there's scope for some really nice experiments here with building, and I'd love to know, can we exclude frost with like frost exclosures, and can we add water? So that there's a lot of scope for some interesting questions and studies.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony. That's very interesting that they died back.
Thanks, Tony. Others can think of questions along if there are. I also have one. So you indicated the recruiting that's so different between Benfontein and Susanna Olifantshoek. Do you think that's a case of the different land use practices, or rather because of the demography, more individuals shedding seed, or what do you think causes that change?
So okay, because they tend to make flowers and pods every year, I'm not sure that it's because of the individuals producing more seeds, and it may be that on Susanna there was, you know, more herbivores to spread the seeds around in certain years. You know, that area, you can, I mean, you know, from that area, sometimes you can have a lot of rain at one site and just a kilometer down the road, it's quite dry. So but I really don't know what's caused the differences in that demography that you see. But yeah, then I do see there's a question from Julia.
Yes, would you like to answer?
Shall I go for that? Thanks, Julia. It's very kind of you. Yeah, I think using rings to age plants. So the question is using rings. You mentioned using rings to age plants and the issue of stems dying and new stems starting from the same root. Also in environments like this, do stems always add a discernible ring every year? I think they don't, if I'm not mistaken. I seem to remember reading some work a while ago that they don't actually give a very discernible ring every year. But then I'm trying to remember how it was dated. And I think Stefan Woodburn has done work on that. But Julia, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure on that. Sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Colleen. No, I was just curious about how does one go about dating in very episodic rain environments. I don't know it either, so I was wondering.
I think they may use isotopes, but I stand under correction. Yeah, I'd have to check. But there was some work done by Caroline. Can't remember her first name, but her surname was Steenkamp, and she dated the camelthorns in Kalahari. So yeah, that would be a place to start looking, and probably I should go check too. Thanks.
One more question. You were alluding to future studies. So what would be the next step? Looking at depth or isotopes, or possibly doing comparative studies between arid and mesic?
Oh, there are lots of studies we could do. I think we could, like I said, I think the saplings would be very interesting to still do a lot of things to, for instance, building frost exclosures, giving water, those things. But then also hopefully, and I don't know what's happened with the NRF funding, but hoping to do some work with Andrew McKechnie looking at water isotopes to try and work out at what size do the saplings start to rely on groundwater. At what point do we start seeing that as a signal in their tissue? And relating that to size of the below ground stem and above ground stems. So that's what we're doing next. But yeah, I see Philip.
Thank you. I see there's a question from Philip.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Colleen, for your wonderful talk. My question is given that these trees are protected, the whole of South Africa, the population, how is the population all across South Africa in terms of we having more of these trees, or they are declining?
Philip, thank you. That's a very good question. In my lifetime, I'm not seeing a big difference in terms of recruitment. As you can see, they seem to be going very slowly. Helga may be able to come in here because she's been measuring them and their growth in the Kalahari, and they seem to have done much better than these. But there has been quite a lot of clearing, and certainly, I think it was in the northwest, that area, I used to drive past on my way to Moropo. There was quite a big area where what had happened was they'd been trying to use a herbicide to get rid of blackthorn, and actually that was done in the 80s, and it was starting to take effect by the early 2000s, and there was just stands and stands of dead camelthorns. So I think the thinking was that because the camelthorn was deep rooted, that the herbicide wouldn't affect them, but actually they then started to die 20 years or almost 20 years after the treatment. I do have some photographs of that. If you're interested, I can send them through to you. But yeah, it's a very interesting question. So I would say they are protected and they should stay protected. And yeah, I think that the department made a good move on protecting them, because the problem is, as humans, we see lots of trees. We don't realize that actually we're looking at hundreds of years of growth when we're looking at these trees. And so just removing them quickly doesn't account for the fact that we're removing a lot of many years of change.
Thank you. On the heels of Philip's question, sort of more of a socio-economic nature, would you be fearful due to this extensive load shedding and electricity problems that people start using it for firewood more often?
You know, that's a good question, Wayne, and I hadn't thought of it. I have noticed when I see my friends nowadays that people are usually having braais instead of dinner in the lunch, in the sense of what's cooked on the oven. You know, it's more of a heating, heating wood. I don't know. I think we have plenty of other sources of wood. I think it will depend on the economics of chopping them down and whether the market is more open to trying to avoid them. So for instance, there's a lot of ethical people tend to be more ethical now when they buy things, if they're aware of it. So I think it's up to us to make audiences aware. But yeah, I always wonder how load shedding is going to impact on things, but I hadn't thought about this. It's a good question.
I see Ryan has a question. Ryan, do you just want to ask it? Shall I read it?
Oh, hi. Okay, hi. Hi, Colleen. Thanks for the presentation. Hi. Yeah. What did I ask? I had a couple. Yeah, I think you mentioned also in response to Tony's question, I was interested in sort of the rainfall characteristics over that time. So do we know about the recruiting events under which these species generally tend to recruit? I did some work with Tim Hoffman, and I was thinking about the aloes that he was looking at. So I was wondering if there's similar dynamics sort of happening there. And then also, I don't know if the area's undergone pivot irrigation, as in some other locations, which could be having an impact on groundwater, or cities and towns depending more on groundwater than they used to before. So I'm wondering if that also maybe plays a role on their growth rates, or yeah.
Yeah. So I know, because this tree has its roots into, okay, so let me go backwards a bit. A few years ago, Dave Joubert did work on mellifera, and they're fairly shallow rooted, and he found that they needed a couple of years of good rainfall. The first year to produce the pods, and the second year to then establish the seedling, for the seedlings to germinate, and the next year to establish. And so he worked out that you needed 3 fairly good rainfall seasons to see recruitment of mellifera. Acacia, Vachellia erioloba, they produce pods anyway, as I say, because they've got their roots in the water, and so they produce seeds anyway. So they probably don't need 3 years, but certainly I noticed there was a much larger recruitment in years that we had good rain. So I really do think that recruitment is linked to rainfall, because I did see a lot of die off of the smaller seedlings in those years. And then the second, oh yes, the groundwater question. That's a really good question, because those farms are near Kimberley, but I'm not sure if Kimberley's water is being fed from the groundwater that's on those 2 farms. So I don't know. Can anybody from the Kimberley area, does anybody have an opinion on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's sort of the reverse. They've been diverting water from the mines to Benfontein quite a bit in this past year. Yeah, overflow and stuff. So it's quite the opposite of draining the groundwater. I would say it's been increasing.
Wow.
But it is hard to say, because where the population is, it's also more elevated and sort of quite far south from where the water goes. If that makes sense. It's sort of on that hill. Yeah. So I can't really say for sure. Maybe Helga has input on that as well.
Yeah.
I see she added some text on Philip's question.
Yeah, Helga says in some areas there is large-scale mortality of mature individuals, and some research is being done, but no clear reason for this mortality. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Helga, where I was working, the farmers said it was that they had used SAEON. I can never say it properly. So I don't know if those are the same areas as where you're working, but I'm sure the farmers would tell you if that's what happened. So if no one knows, then there's something else going on.
Colleen, there's a lot of pressure on the mines in the Kathu area, especially. Because they've got, and lots of people say it's because of the water extraction that this is causing a problem. That, or even the dust from the mines. I mean, those trees are blood red from the mining dust.
So is that's been going on for about 20 years, those trees dying?
Yes, and nobody's got a concrete sort of reasoning or hardcore sort of significant differences that we can clearly say this is happening or that's happening. So it's very difficult.
Wow.
Too many variables.
That's the joy of science.
Thanks, Helga, for the input. There's no further questions. I've just one. Do you plan on resurveying anytime soon? I'm particularly thinking of that massive fire we had that killed a lot of adult eriolobas.
Yes. At the moment, we've got a student who's busy looking at the die-off of the large ones. But yeah, to go and look at the saplings again would be interesting. The same 67 that we can find. That would be a nice thing to do. I see Philip's got his hand up.
Yeah, I think we'll take one more question from Philip. Thanks.
Well, it's not a question, but it's just a comment, because I've been looking at this tree for a couple of years, maybe 5 to 6 years. with interest, because I'm not clued up, involved in the botany kind of a section. I managed to grow this tree. I can grow 20 to 50 of them, or maybe hundreds of them. So it's a really interesting tree, because I mean, I grew up close to those trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. Well, on that note, thank you, Colleen. This was an awesome talk and really great discussion. Yeah, good luck. I hope we see more of the results coming through and what happens with these eriolobas in the future.
Yes, and thank you very much for the chance to talk to you all, and for the very stimulating questions. You've triggered a whole lot of other things that I have to think about now. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And then for everyone else, the next seminar will be early March. It will be by Glenn, working on the new R package for SAEON. Date will be confirmed later by Caitlin. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye.